The first time I played Mass Effect 2's final mission was an unforgettable experience. The tension was palpable, the stakes were high, and part of the reason I was so invested was because if I knew I messed up or made the wrong choice, my beloved crew members were going to die. These characters, who I'd spent so much time talking and bonding with, have put their lives in my hands. And if I made the wrong choice, one or more of them would be gone forever. Unless, of course, I save scum my way out of it, but that is cheating. And I would never do that. As a game master, I want to bring that energy to the RPGs that I run, but I'm not exactly sure how. So let's take a look at what this mission does well, expand on it, and figure out how to apply it to tabletop RPGs. On the surface, this mission is pretty simple. Make decisions, deal with the consequences. If you choose someone without technical expertise to go into the vents, they take a rocket to the face. And yeah, in isolation, this is a pretty simple concept, but there are a lot of different choices to be made in this mission, and a bunch of different choices that happen before the mission even starts. So it quickly becomes this web of choices that's kind of hard to keep track of, unless you have a tool to do that, like this flowchart, which was posted by Game Informer back in 2010. I don't know if they're the original author, but it's the earliest source I could find. If you want a perfect ending in Mass Effect 2, use this flowchart. Or another version, there are a ton of them. My point is, the choices themselves aren't particularly interesting. It's just a simple binary. But they become much more interesting when they interact with each other in more interesting and complex situations. Let's take another look at those vents I mentioned earlier. I said if you don't send a technical expert into the vents, they're gonna die. And that is true, but that's not all there is to it. There are a couple more choices to be made in this section. First, you choose who is going into the vents. Let's say you choose Tali because she has technical expertise. Great. Did you complete her loyalty mission earlier in the game? No? But if you did, she's still not safe. At the beginning of this section, you don't just choose who's going into the vents. You also choose who is leading a second fire team. Hopefully you chose someone with leadership experience. You didn't? Okay, let's go back. You chose Garrus, and he's the best, so that works. But did you complete his loyalty mission? No? You monster. So this one section requires 5 different choices to be made for the vent specialist to survive. Each individual choice is simple, but you have to get them all right for your friend to make it through. But how do you make singular choices more interesting? There are a ton of different ways to expand on simple choices, and they require you, the designer, to make some decisions of your own. Like whether or not you want to telegraph what will happen when they make that choice. Going back to the Mass Effect example, it telegraphs the hell out of its choices. Take a look at this clip.
It's not a fortress, there's gotta be something. Here, maybe we can send someone in through this ventilation shaft.
Practically a suicide mission. I volunteer.
I appreciate the thought, Jacob, but you couldn't shut down the security systems in time. We need to send a tech expert.
It's your call, Commander. Who do we send into the shaft?
Jacob volunteers for this mission, but we are straight up told that he will not be successful, or at least he won't survive it. And we need a tech specialist. There's clearly a correct choice to make here if you're paying attention. Whether or not you think it's a good idea to telegraph the choices to your players, you don't want to be too heavy-handed. You want to allow for their agency, but also make sure they understand what they're getting into, or at least could look back on it and realize that it was there the whole time. On the flip side, you could have choices with no telegraphing whatsoever. This would essentially be like the briefing scene, but no one gives any input on the choices. They just say there's an event, someone needs to go through it, and someone needs to lead a second fire team. But they leave you to figure out who's best to do that without any additional information. If you've ever played the Banner Saga, you'll be familiar with these types of choices. That game rarely, if ever, telegraphs the result of its choices to an almost infuriating extent. You're given no clues as to what will happen, and the choices are almost random and arbitrary, since similar decisions aren't always consistent with the results across the games. You could spice things up by expanding on these choices, basically giving whatever they decide both pros and cons, so they have to weigh what's most important to them, and choose based on that. Like, if you send Jacob into the vent, then he will die, but he'll provide some other benefit to the fight a tech expert couldn't. Or you could use Tali and she'll get the job done and she'll survive to tell about it, but the fight will be significantly harder. But also keep in mind, there is no right answer here. There is no perfect way to craft any of these choices. This is just a toolbox of ideas that you can use to create the moment that you were trying to achieve. Now, all this talk of binary choices is all well and good in video games where your choices are restricted to what a computer will allow. But what about tabletop RPGs? By their nature, they're much more open and flexible. How do you account for the roll of the dice or the inevitable and unexpected creative solutions your players come up with? You could give them a choice of who do you send into the vent, and they could say, I cast enlarge on the vent so everyone can get in. Or they could say, subscribe to Castlecaster and like and comment on this video, and if you really like it, then, consider becoming a channel member to get some perks. Players say the darndest things, There are a couple different strategies that I recommend to deal with this sort of thing. You can set up guardrails, you can build in consequences, or you can build flexibility into the choices themselves. Guardrails are built-in features of the situation the choices exist in. In the previous ventilation example, you can say that the architecture of the collector base is magically infused and therefore resistant to magic, preventing them from casting any spells on it. And this is a simple solution, but it can be kind of boring, and players can catch on to that sort of thing and make it feel like you're railroading them. Another way is to build in consequences. If the vent is enlarged, that would cause a lot of structural damage. It could break away from the rest of the ventilation system, and now all that burning hot air that was confined to the vent is now filling the room, making the task more difficult for everyone. And again, this helps solve the problem, and it's usually fun to add more obstacles, but done too often, it might feel like it's being done solely to punish the players for going off the rails. That's not to say you shouldn't use these strategies. I think they're pretty good options. Just use them thoughtfully and don't overuse them. On the other side of the coin, you can build flexibility into the choice by leaving the situation more open and leaving some choices up to the dice. One of the ways you can do this is creating fairly open sandbox situations, leaving the choices they make unsaid. You might have designed an encounter with a choice, but if you leave it for them to intuit, instead of you just telling them what they need to choose between, then that can make the players feel like they made the choice or they figured out your puzzle. In the Mass Effect example, you can just design the environment and have them make checks to perceive certain obstacles or situations and let them figure it out as they go. Or, since this is a game with dice, you can let them decide. Dice are the ultimate neutral arbiter, and if you need a choice made, sometimes it's best to leave it to the gods. It can add tension and uncertainty to a moment where the players can't or won't decide. Maybe it's a choice that needs to be made for them, or maybe they make a choice and you need to determine the results. So now we have some resources to help us create choices. Great, but how do we make them matter? How do we make our players sweat when they're presented with one? Well, it all comes to a pretty simple but vital storytelling concept: stakes. Stories need stakes if they're going to have any sense of tension, and Mass Effect 2 has higher stakes than most video games I've ever played. Literally all life in the galaxy is at stake. If we don't stop the Reapers, everybody dies. But the thing is, when I played through the Mass Effect series, I didn't really care that much about the Reapers, or their galaxy-ending threat. I mean, I did, but those stakes were so big that they sort of ceased to matter after a certain point. When I was playing through the final mission in Mass Effect 2, I wasn't worried about whether or not I would stop the Reapers. This was a story, after all. I knew that was going to happen. What I was worried about was my squad. These characters I'd spent so much time getting to know, recruiting them, talking with them after every mission, and earning their loyalty on personal missions. This era of BioWare was so good at writing characters. Most of them were so interesting and charismatic, you couldn't help but fall in love with them. And then, that final mission put a gun to their collective heads. Now, it's personal. Now I care. Stakes need to be personal to really matter to a story. So if you want to raise the stakes, threaten what your players care about. Maybe, like in Mass Effect, it's the NPCs, but maybe NPCs aren't your strong suit, and you're more of a world builder. Well, in most sci-fi and fantasy RPGs, you can threaten cities just as easily as you can threaten people. But the things you threaten don't have to be life and limb. Maybe there's an extremely advantageous option available, but it's a moral dilemma. Or it could come at the cost of their self-image, or their reputation, or an important relationship in their life. Or it could be something purely mechanical, like their magic items, or their abilities. If they're a cleric, warlock, or paladin, a choice could be made between their patron, or oath, and something that is really important to them. Their class could be at stake. The main 2 points of this section are that stakes are important. They're a vital pillar of all forms of storytelling, and that stakes need to be personal to be effective. You can threaten the world all you want, but at the end of the day, the Reapers aren't real, and we've all seen so many stories with world-ending threats that we're pretty much desensitized to them. But you threaten my boy Garrus, or you threaten Tali, or you threaten Legion? Well, now I'm in, and I'm going to do my absolute best to make sure that they survive. Or you could always threaten the player characters themselves. And within that, there's another choice. Do you execute characters when they're unconscious, or do you leave it up to the death save, specifically in 5e? Click this video over here for a more in-depth discussion on that idea. Shout out to my channel members, Vifa Fox, my mom, Caleb Eggensberger, Xenon, Ali Asylum, Wellaboot1, and FireGen1. If you found this video helpful in any way, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to support my channel, consider becoming a member. You get your name shouted out at the end of every long-form video, and I didn't finish my script, whoops. And you get to see the long-term videos a couple days early. Thank you so much for watching.